Good afternoon. I'm John Bridgeland, and it's just such a privilege to be in what's been called the greatest seat of democracy in the history of the world here at the U.S. Senate, not in a congressional hearing, but in what I guess I would call the great unleashing, the unleashing of voices all across this country, those who've tragically experienced horrifying events, and those who've dealt with the aftermath of pain. We just heard from those in Orlando who suffered that horrific tragedy. And I want to call out the extraordinary men and Leslie from Chicago Cred who shared their stories and their pain, but also their hopes about the future. My dear friend Arnie Duncan, we had the privilege of working on the high school dropout issue over so many years to bring more hope to people across this country. And I remember when he left the Obama administration, and I said, Arnie, you could do anything. What are you going to do? He said, you know, when I was superintendent of Chicago Public Schools, I got tired of losing our kids. I got tired of losing our kids. And so I just want to thank Arnie for dedicating his wonderful life to the future of so many young people and the safety of our communities and country. I also want to call out Richard Small and Gerardo Marquez, one a Republican, an NRA member, another a Democrat, both gun owners who love to hunt, who share property together, and don't really agree on very much in terms of politics. But they have come together on this issue of gun safety. And it's that spirit represented by Richard and Gerardo that I hope we can bring to America and communities all across this land and to the U.S. Congress. So I'm thrilled to add my voice to 24/7 The People's Filibuster for Gun Safety, a subject of keeping our children, our communities, all Americans safe from gun violence in our schools, our workplaces, our faith-based institutions, and other places where Americans gather. I thought Leslie said it so compellingly. Do you have to go send your children into school and have fear? Do you have to go into a grocery store or a shopping mall and have the fear that you may not come out? Do you have to go in and pray to your God, whatever your God may be, and be fearful that prayer may end with those around you? So I grew up in a household with a dad and a grandfather who were gun owners. They liked to hunt. They liked to keep deer out of the garden. But they also were very clear about the appropriate use of guns and the importance of keeping them safely stored. I'm also testifying from my perspective as the former director of the White House Domestic Policy Council for President Bush. And Arnie spoke so compellingly about how Americans tend to come together out of shared pain. And when terrorists struck in 3 cities across America on 9/11, there were millions of acts of kindness and goodness and decency that brought this country together. But it didn't last. And we need to think about what can we do to bring Americans together in shared problem solving for the future of our children and all of us, and not just out of shared pain. I also remember being the chief of staff for a U.S. congressman from Ohio. And the first day I started, I remember getting a phone call from the We're Fed Up group in Harrison, Ohio, because there was a gun reform bill up on the House floor for passage. And the man threatened to give us a belly full of buckshot if we took away his guns. So I also know the reality and the sentiments out in America that gravitate toward violence. I also had the pleasure of serving President Obama on this White House Council of Community Solutions, and we went around to 39 communities across the United States trying to help Opportunity Youth, young people who were out of school and out of work. We constantly were facing in these communities the threat of gun violence and fear and a lack of trust, and found it very difficult to reconnect young people in a culture of fear. My other context for testifying is actually very local. Over the past 20 years, I've co-chaired with Ethel Kennedy, who's the widow of Robert F. Kennedy, who also was cut down by gun violence in California as he was running for president. And she, too, like Arnie, could be doing anything. but she co-chairs the Earth Conservation Corps, which gives young people in the most impoverished and vulnerable communities in Washington, D.C., the opportunity to enter a year of national service to help clean up the Anacostia River. And I was so heartened. They found out that the nation's symbol, the bald eagle, had not been in Washington, D.C. since 1947 because the environment was too polluted. So they fledged bald eagles in Wisconsin and were part of the small core of young people who brought the nation's symbol back to the nation's capital. I remember Ed Bradley did a program called Endangered Species, not only about the bald eagle, but about the young people who were being repeatedly cut down. Tragically, in the process of serving their neighbors and nation, we lost a lot of Corps members to gun violence. And you'll hear today from LaShante Moore, one of our Corps members who made it and now works at the what happened to her other Corps members. In each context of my public service, I've seen the issue of gun violence and gun safety emerge and have studied the issues carefully, wanting to promote both public safety and save lives, and also wanting to protect individual liberty. I remember the pressures we were under again and again and again, but I would remind the American people and members of Congress the Second Amendment states a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The amendment actually contemplates regulation, and we ought to view it as a public health issue, just as we use safety in cars as a public health issue. It signals that militias are necessary for the protection of our country and confirms a right to keep and bear arms in the context of this security. As Richard said, yeah, you may need an AR-15 in the context of the Vietnam War, but do we need it in the context of hunting and self-defense in our communities? The slaughter of Americans with guns is well known. There have been more than 240 mass shootings in 2022 alone. Lives cut down, as these young people so courageously stated, dreams lost, children and families and friends suffering endless traumas and pain, parents full of fear to send their children to schools, workers worried about whether their workplaces are safe, churches, synagogues, and mosques. We've seen violence in them all. I've also seen the remarkable courage of the American people who've suffered this violence and the mothers of young children slaughtered in elementary schools. People like Scarlett Lewis out of Sandy Hook, whose foundation is now called Choose Love, who out of this extraordinary evil and hatred has chosen love. I've also, the vast majority of Americans support common sense reforms and want the violence to stop. While no measure is a complete answer to this complex problem, there are things that we can do. In public policy, the challenge is always to first marshal evidence of effectiveness, to identify solutions that would help address the challenge. Unfortunately, there's a shocking lack of research on gun violence and how best to stop it. Some may use this as an argument to do nothing, but studies, the laboratories of democracy across states and communities, surveys of the American people, and common sense can direct us down a productive path. I want to start by sharing that last night, Fox News released a poll of registered voters conducted from June 10th to June 13th of this year. 88% support background checks to purchase guns. 82% support raising the legal age to 21 for assault rifles, and 78% to raise the legal age to 21 for all guns. 81% of the American people support red flag laws, 80% background checks for ammunition, 77% to require a 30-day waiting period, 70% to ban high-capacity clips, and 63% to ban assault weapons. The only reforms that a majority of Americans do not support, you probably can guess, are teachers carrying guns and more citizens carrying guns. This Fox News poll shows that Americans clearly want gun safety reform. Passing red flag laws to make it easier to remove guns from potentially dangerous people would protect Americans from violence without an undue burden on the Second Amendment. multiple studies have found certain characteristics common to mass shooters. Nearly all of them are males who act alone, have experienced significant stress or loss at home, and plan their actions for some time in advance. Some have histories of domestic violence, others bullied by peers, isolated from friends, even outcast. School shooters often exhibit behavioral problems at home and at school and have grievances with peers. Still others suffer mental health challenges, and often such conditions go undiagnosed. Increasingly, with the advent and culture of social media that broadcasts visibility and attention, many shooters exhibit some form of what has been called pre-violence leakage, communicating their plans in advance to other people in writing or over social media. These communications have proven to be among the most reliable identifiers of potentially dangerous individuals. So this policy of enabling police officers to temporarily take away guns from people who seem to pose an imminent danger has some promising evidence behind it. A study in California, I can't help myself, I'm a little bit of a policy wonk, and being here in the Senate, I envision myself briefing a senator or member of Congress. A study in California that looked at how this process got used over a 2-year period found 21 occasions when it was done in response to threats of a mass shooting in California, several of which involved schools. Think about that for a minute, the lives saved, the trauma averted, the pain that did not occur. While more studies are merited, common sense also indicates that with a more attuned public and the tool of red flag laws, more potential shooters will be stopped. Congress should provide incentives and support to states and localities that adopt red flag laws so that these valuable tools are widespread across America. Conducting background checks is another powerful tool that protects both public safety and individual liberty. In addition to the strong support for background checks from the Fox News poll, other surveys show that background checks for all gun owners has the support of 93% of gun owners and 96% of those without guns. Preventing violent criminals, the mentally ill, Americans on no-fly and watch lists from owning guns would also improve community safety without unacceptable infringement of the Second Amendment right. Loopholes should also be closed so that background checks apply to those who try to purchase guns through private sales or at gun shows. Those who wish to purchase guns for legitimate purposes should have no fear of a background check. Some states have restricted who gets access to guns, reflecting the common sense of the American people. Consider the story of 2 states that took divergent paths. In 1995, Connecticut tightened its gun licensing laws. A decade later, Missouri eased them. Homicide rates with guns dropped 40% in Connecticut, while such rates rose 25% in Missouri. There are many factors at work, no doubt, but what is clear is that by focusing on who gets access to guns, the communities and states that sensibly limit such access have better outcomes. Cities and states with strong gun laws still experience gun violence, and no law on any matter prevents all harms. But the most reasonable counterfactual is that gun violence would be far worse without strong common sense laws. We can do better. Another reasonable policy that I thought Gerardo and Richard talked so compellingly about as educators and superintendents who interact with young men and women is raising the age for purchasing a gun to 21. It's actually ironic in the country that you have to be 21 to purchase a handgun, but an 18 to 20-year-old can buy an assault weapon. There's also been a lot of discussion of the assault weapons ban and whether it's been effective. One wonders if the Second Amendment actually confers an individual right to a military arsenal. Assault weapons are the weapons of choice in mass shootings, and common sense tells us that assault weapons are valuable in military contexts, but not for hunting and self-defense. While Congress works to pass bipartisan legislation to improve public safety and safeguard individual rights, it should also make investments in research on gun violence. One way to do that would be to provide the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention with the resources it needs to research gun violence, what causes it and what prevents it. Grants should also be given to research institutions with demonstrated capacity to study the issue objectively and with sound protocols. Congress and the administration have made significant strides in evidence-based policymaking. I've been up on this Capitol Hill time and time again at the What Works Caucus talking about the evidence and how it can drive policy on all sorts of issues over the last 20 years. So investing a portion of appropriations in research that can tell us what works and what doesn't to keep Americans safe and protect their rights would provide valuable insights to policymakers. In the last week, Senators Chris Murphy and Senator John Cornyn, as Arnie mentioned, with 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans, have been working tirelessly to pull together bipartisan support behind a framework for action on gun safety. And the House of Representatives has passed a comprehensive bill. We should applaud and encourage these efforts. It's a spirit and moment of national unity in a really difficult, polarized time. But we also know that supermajority views of Americans don't always translate into action, that frameworks often don't become bills, and bills don't become negotiated settlements that come into law. And so the people's filibuster, hearing from those online, those in this congressional room, both in the Senate, tomorrow in the House, again and again and again and 24/7 is so critical. As we contemplate the lives lost from gun violence over the decades, the escalating mass shootings in recent years that have become so normalized that some are barely covered by the media anymore, and the fear and pain spreading through American communities, Congress can take a strong stand to follow the directional evidence that we have, the extraordinary stories of these young people who are working every day to keep our communities safe, and the overwhelming views of the American people. They can pass laws to limit access to guns for those who represent a risk of their violent misuse, with the tools of red flag laws, background checks, raising the age to purchase, an assault weapons ban, and to invest in mental health, school supports, and other measures that can improve public safety and respect individual liberty. You know, I grew up when I was a little boy at a time when my first memory, my little feet sticking out watching a program that my mom was watching, and it was interrupted because John F. Kennedy had been assassinated by a gunman. And I remember then being in elementary school, and the superintendent came over the loudspeaker and said another hero of my young life, Robert F. Kennedy, had been gunned down in California. And then I remember a third hero, and it became a song, popular song on the radio, about another hero who talked about a dream at the Lincoln Memorial and how often I listened to that speech, his dream for his four little children. And we'll hear from Bernice King on Sunday, on Father's Day, Martin Luther King gunned down. And I think back on that horrific history, and I think about the coming together of the American people around this extraordinary moment. And Congress can't solve everything, as I think Leslie and others mentioned, but it can do something. So let's make this a moment where we do more than something. Thank you.